Yep. Okay, we are live and recording. So folks will be joining in now. Here they come. Welcome, welcome. My name is Nick Hool. I'll be kind of running admin duties for this as folks are joining us in. Wow, they're starting to pile in. This is great. If you could just go ahead and put your name and where you're calling in from in the chat, just to kind of get the conversation started. We'll give it a minute or two to let folks queue up. A couple other housekeeping ideas. Like I said, my name is Nick Hool. I'll be running the chat and asking any questions anyone puts there. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. But we're also going to try letting some folks speak throughout this as well. So if you do have a question that you would like to voice publicly, go ahead and raise your hand, and I will call on you as it kind of makes sense to throughout the conversation. So hopefully we can have a little more of a town hall sort of feel. We've got some folks chiming in now. Tina Marie from Atlanta, Georgia. Tina, great to have you on. Just spoke to you yesterday. Great to have you on here. Nessia,
a lot of people are chiming in. Only two panelists are not chiming in to other attendees.
Yep.
Just a note to hit the little bottom, two panelists and attendees when you're.
Yes, if you want others to be able to read your comments, please go ahead and hit panelists and attendees. Good call, Gary.
Yeah.
Nancy
St. Louis County Library, welcome. Yeah.
Harley Feinberg, awesome. Hussein, also from San Antonio. Cool, some San Antonio folks. This is great.
Baltimore, yep, good.
Very, very good, very good. All right, well, now that we're at about 20 folks on, I feel like that's a good kind of starting cohort. Some more folks will probably join us as we go along. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to our founder, Gary Schoniger, to kind of get things rolling. Sound good, Gary?
Yep, let's go. Thank you, Nick, and welcome everyone. I'm super excited to have this conversation with you all today. I've gotten to know Duncan over the last couple of months, or last couple of years actually, and so I'm excited to have this conversation. So I want to do a quick introduction for Duncan, and we're going to roll right in here to this conversation as part of our series about entrepreneurship in education. So as both an entrepreneur and a librarian, Duncan Smith served as the general manager for EBSCO's NoveList division for 25 plus years. Now, the NoveList division is based on the database product that he co-founded along with two friends. So that makes him a librarian and an entrepreneur. So as EBSCO's chief strategist for public libraries, Duncan will discuss on this webinar how libraries are becoming a more vital part of entrepreneurial ecosystems throughout the United States. Duncan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Gary. You're welcome. I'm very excited to be here. As the names have scrolled through on the participants list, I see some many friends and colleagues. So I'm very happy that they're here. Unfortunately, they're probably going to hear me say the same thing I've said to them many times before. So really, I'm very grateful that there's some people on here that I don't know because they get to hear this stuff fresh. I think right out of the gate, Gary, one of the things I want to suggest, right, is that you referred to me as a librarian and an entrepreneur, okay? One of the points I want to make that's very important is that I believe that one of your definitions of entrepreneur is somebody who solves problems for others. Is that correct? Is that an accurate description?
100%.
Okay. Well, if that's 100% accurate definition, then librarians are 100% entrepreneurs, because that's what we do all day long. People bring us their questions, and those questions frequently result from a problem, and they ask us to help them. So there seems to, and that actually, when we talk about misunderstanding entrepreneurs and being entrepreneurial, that's really at the heart of it, is we have this entrepreneurial mindset set over here for a certain group of people.
Right.
When in essence, there are many of us in many contexts and many organizations that are serving basically an entrepreneurial function.
Yeah, right on. There's a lot to unpack there, Duncan. I mean, that's the cross that we at Eli bear, that the world has changed in ways that now require everyone to be more innovative and entrepreneurial. That doesn't mean to say they should all start businesses, right?
That's right.
But we have to be more innovative and entrepreneurial in order to adapt and thrive in this rapidly changing world that we now find ourselves in. So let's start by exploring, Duncan, the connection between libraries and entrepreneurship. And I mean, I think, that might not seem to a lot of folks, going back to what you just said,
Yeah.
like a natural fit. Like that might seem like an odd or combination, entrepreneur and librarian. So let's start, I want to start by asking you, how is this changing? How are libraries getting involved in entrepreneurship? How is this changing?
Right. So I think that one of the things another point that I want to make is that libraries have always been involved in supporting entrepreneurs and supporting the business community. Always. Okay. There's really a great book. Hey, I'm still a librarian, so I am going to talk about books a little bit here, called A Part of Our Lives. That's a people's history of the public library in the United States. Very readable. Okay. In that book, there is a story of a library in the Northeast, small town public library in the Northeast, and this guy in a suit walks up to the reference desk and says to the librarian, "You don't recognize me because I used to be like those guys sitting over there in the magazine room who were unemployed during the Depression, because this was during the Depression, and they just spent their days in the library reading. Well, I was over there reading one of your magazines, and it talked about a contest to come up with an idea to deal with a particular type of insect." And I got to thinking about how to do that. And I came up with an idea, and that won that contest. And that also was the foundation of the successful business I'm running today. So I just want to thank you.
Yeah.
1930 something, that happened. Right.
Right.
So a more recent update of that to show just how significant this is. 2 years ago, a research group, OCLC, the librarians on the call will know that acronym, but it stands for the Online Computer Library Center. It's a big research facility in Columbus, Ohio. They did a study that sort of did a market segmentation of public library users, called From Awareness to Funding. And they had a market segment called the Library as Office. And what they found was that about 3.4% of the people who were using the public library were using it to do work related either to their business or to their careers. And the other thing they found was that even though that was only 3.4%, that group used the library more than any other group in terms of visits, in terms of accessing the website. The other thing they found is that they felt that librarians were more reliable and got them their answers quicker than Google.
Wow.
And that population was also more likely to make financial contributions to the public library. They were more likely to donate than any other group. So even though some of my colleagues might not realize how much is going on in terms of their supporting entrepreneurs. That work is happening in their stacks and in their desks and on their websites. And it's always just been an important part of what we do, just one of the things. But that
Yeah.
population
Yeah.
is smaller, right? So I tend to refer to the people, to the entrepreneurs who use their public libraries as, that group is not like our mystery readers, who are a large and well-known and very visible group in the public library. They're more like our genealogists and local history people. It's
Yeah.
a small group of individuals who have a very focused purpose and are high frequency users. Okay.
Mm. Right.
So I think also that, two other things that have come up, and we were going to talk about this earlier, but over recent years, the Kauffman Foundation and Google have made investments to help public libraries explore how to be more effective contributors to their local ecosystems. And so both of those agencies are really making an investment. That's the only word for it.
Right.
In helping public libraries who are frequently cash strapped and resource strained, to help them get the capacity to begin to explore new ways of serving this important population.
Yeah. Yeah. Duncan, I'm listening to you and I realize, and we could talk about this or not, but like I owe a huge debt of gratitude to public libraries for my own, for my own entrepreneurial origins. And in my 20s, late 1980s, I took a borrowed ladder, strapped it on the roof of my car, and went door to door in a wealthy neighborhood offering to clean the leaves out of people's gutters. And, I showed up on time, I presented myself well, did what I said I was going to do. And I noticed people started asking me to solve other problems. And if I didn't know how to solve their problem, I went to the Cleveland Heights Public Library on Lee Road in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. And I found, this was back, before internet. This is, before smartphones and whatever. But that's what I did. I went to the library to finance it. I figured out, somebody would say, well, my garage door is not working. Can you fix that for me? And I would say, yes. How am I going to do that? I don't know yet, but off to the library I'd go. So I get it. And I think this is an exciting idea that libraries can become sort of a central convening place or a central body of knowledge for people that want to be innovative and entrepreneurial. But let's talk about the flip side, Duncan. Like, I just want to ask you, like, how might this be challenging to a librarian that doesn't know about entrepreneurship, or what are the challenges from the librarian side?
Well, I think there are actually the Urban Libraries Council, which was the recipient of one of the Kauffman grants, did some research on looking at, they sort of did a national scan a few years ago. And what they found was that there were kind of like three primary barriers to public libraries becoming more effective in serving entrepreneurs. The first one was because libraries are the people's university, and we'll unpack that later. There are a lot of priorities, a lot of demands, and a limited amount of resources. So when libraries prioritize their mission, sometimes other things get in front of serving that population. Makes sense.
Right. Yeah.
The other thing that is also a sort of a limitation is the lack of staff capacity. And that capacity is in two ways. One is just the number of hours in the day, but also the knowledge and comfort level of working with and speaking with the business community. A lot of my colleagues are very, very good and skilled at working with the business community. We have some exemplary programs out there, but there are a lot of librarians who are uncomfortable talking about business, thinking about business, because many of us went into this profession with very altruistic motivations.
Right.
Okay. So there's that issue. And the other issue that I want to speak to both groups who are on our call today, librarians and non-librarians, is another major barrier is the library not being seen as a player.
Right.
In the local, which is this whole topic that we're talking about today. You never thought about the library as a place to, that little awareness that you just had, Gary, of how the library contributed to your early development as an entrepreneur.
Right.
That insight doesn't happen unless you have a focused conversation about this topic.
Yeah.
Okay. So that barrier is another thing. So just, working those capacity things, and I know lots of colleagues who are they're embedded in their local business community. There are all these kinds of programs and events going on. It's not unusual, Kauffman's Million Cups program. It's not unusual for the public library to be the gathering place.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And all right, so let me talk about that for a second, Duncan. I was at Kauffman when they launched that, when they birthed the 1 million cups. And I sort of describe it as an AA meeting for entrepreneurs. It's a really organic sort of an assembly where local entrepreneurs who have ideas can show up, and the rest of the community shows up intending to support that entrepreneur. It's not like a business plan pitch. It's the entrepreneurs given just a very short amount of time, a few minutes to stand up and talk about their ideas, what they're trying to accomplish. And then members of the community can come forth and sort of address the fundamental question of how can we help you?
Right.
And the library is the perfect place to convene those. And I've attended these 1 million cups events all over the United States. And they're really, really instrumental in sort of giving the entrepreneur their initial lift, where people come out of the woodwork and start to help them with their ideas.
Well, and I mentioned that book earlier on People's History. In that book, they talk about the 3 pillars of public library service. One is supporting commonplace or pleasure reading. 2 is providing useful information, which you used in your early entrepreneurial days, right? This is how you fix the garage door. And then the 3rd one is a community gathering place. Now, of course, COVID has gotten in the way of, hopefully those days are slowly, we're moving away from those days. But the idea of the library's meeting rooms being available for groups, many of those were closed down. Libraries pivoted in many wonderful ways of translating a lot of their programming to digital and Zoom, like we're doing here today. Eli used to do all of your facilitator training as in-person training, and you have pivoted quite successfully to be able to do this via the technology, right?
Yeah.
Libraries also did that, right? Libraries, when you were talking a few minutes ago, I kind of felt like, you were sort of like a one-person bookmobile going around Cleveland Heights, taking this little bits of knowledge and information to your customers in a way. But, one of the things that libraries did was, and are doing, is they're literally driving hotspots into communities that have poor internet connectivity. Because I think, I'm always leery of quoting numbers that I don't have in front of me. That's my librarian training. I shouldn't make a quote without having the source, but I'm going to do it anyway. This is the entrepreneur side of me talking. something like 35% of the people who have incomes less than $50,000, the public library is their primary internet connectivity resource.
Mm.
So this is a huge equity and equal opportunity challenge, right?
Yeah.
And that actually is one of the public library's central premises, in my opinion, is that it is a free resource to the members of a community where those members can learn what they want to learn to the best of their ability. There actually used to be a great quote in the American Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Manual that went something like this. It is the library, and the library is in the library and in the library alone that an individual can learn to the limits of their ability, the limits of what is known.
Mm. Yeah, I like it.
You know, and that's sort of like the foundation that
Right. Well,
you know
that goes along with my I sort of think of entrepreneurship, and we can unpack this, what that term means and all this, but I think of entrepreneurship as a discovery process, like an opportunity discovery process, right? So the way I think about entrepreneurship is sort of from an organismic perspective. I don't even really think of it as a business discipline. I see that the human organism searching for a connection with its environment by making itself useful, right? And so, like, I think it's really helpful, specifically for librarians, to understand this sort of redefinition of entrepreneurship as an opportunity discovery place, because that's what makes the library all of a sudden relevant, right?
That's right.
It's the connection between the knowledge and the effort and the outcome. That's, Duncan, I started Eli in 2007 because I quickly realized that, entrepreneurship is very important. It's not only a mechanism by which individuals can empower themselves by figuring out how to make themselves useful to other humans, but it's also essential as an activity for creating vibrant, equitable, and sustainable communities. But at the same time, and again, this is why I started Eli, at the same time, Duncan, it's just not very well understood. So it's really, really important, but for most people, like, the entrepreneurial person and the entrepreneurial process remain largely a mystery. And the space is fraught with so many myths and misconceptions, as the entrepreneur is the gambler or the careful planner or whatever. That's why we started Eli. What we were seeing is that the ways in which entrepreneurs portrayed in the classroom is largely divorced from the reality of what a typical entrepreneur is actually doing. And
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's several things several kind of points I want to make here is that your guest in the I think in the inaugural one of this series was Tony Wagner. Is that right? Or at least
Correct. Yeah.
And I remember in watching that that session, you and Tony did a lot of talking about curiosity and what happens to curiosity as someone moves through the school system. Okay.
Yep.
Libraries are all about celebrating, supporting, and sustaining curiosity.
Yeah.
And curiosity based on what the user wants to know, as opposed to some predefined curriculum.
It's self-directed.
It's absolutely self-directed.
Right.
That's
And
right.
self-directed learning is,
yeah. I mean, the public library is actually basically a community, is the community's best example of an open classroom, if you want to use an educational term.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really gets at the heart of something important, Duncan. And I think, one of the other things Tony and I were talking about on that webinar is skills gap, the skills gap. Everyone's talking about the skills gap, right? Employers can't find, the type of people they need with the skills they need. But I was thinking underneath the skills gap is sort of a mindset gap. And so people don't really, what I mean by that more specifically is we're so inured to other directed learning that we've lost sight of the power of self-directed learning. And that's what I have observed in the hundreds and hundreds of entrepreneurs that I've interviewed. A lot of them aren't great students in the traditional sense, myself included. But within the entrepreneurial context, we become avid, lifelong, self-directed learners.
Well, I mean, I saw Nancy Kispa was one of the participants in today. I'm a big Nancy fan, and I remember her telling me this story after going through Ice House, that she realized that she had a problem at home with people not picking up their clothes for something, and she basically did an opportunity canvas of figuring out how to solve that problem. I mean, that was entrepreneurial. And Nancy, if I've misrepresented you, just sort of get with me after this is all over.
Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story, Nancy. Right.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. I'm glad to know that's right. But I mean, even something as mundane like and it works. That's even better. In North Carolina, the state bird is a cardinal. Okay, but there's another big little red bird that's basically a scarlet tanager, and they're very rare and very hard to see. And you look at them and you think, is that a cardinal or is that this? And so I finally, and I'm not a big birder by nature, but I kept getting confused. So I, went to a website and listened to what the calls were, so that I could distinguish if I visually couldn't distinguish if they were singing, I could at least do it that way. I mean, that's cute. Did that make the world a better place?
Yeah.
Maybe not. Made me happier.
Yeah.
And feeling that I had accomplished something. That,
right.
and fed my curiosity, and so that, the public library is an open classroom, but the People's University does have a curriculum. And the curriculum is this thing we call life.
Yeah.
No one, with the rare exception of someone trying to do a homework assignment back in the day, no one is forced to come to the public library. People choose.
Right. There's no coercion. There's no manipulation. It's self-directed.
That's right. I mean, and that self-direction may come out of a necessity. I don't have internet access anywhere else. And the fact that I have to fill out my job application to online, that may drive me there.
Right. Well, but here's the thing, Duncan. I mean, this is what sparked it for me. And as you and I have talked many times about this, I was not a great student. By the end of high school, I had emotionally, intellectually dropped out. I still showed up. I graduated. I don't know how, but I did. But my early entrepreneurial experiences made the connection in my mind that when I'm able to pursue my own interests and develop skills in ways that benefit other humans, I become optimally engaged. I now understand the connection between the knowledge and the effort and the outcome. I'm no longer functioning, in an other directed way. I'm no longer operating on an external locus of control. And I'm forever talking about this, the ways in which, we become so imbued in this sort of other directed thinking. And we lose sight of the fact that we're capable of learning, not only capable of learning, but desirous of learning. Right. The satisfaction you experience when you figured out the difference between the bird calls. Like nature rewards you for that with dopamine, with a feeling of joy for figuring it out. Like that's what we often lose sight of. And that's where the library kind of was this pivotal place for me in my own entrepreneurial journey, because I made that connection.
Yeah.
Right.
I just think it's so funny that you look at what's behind me and we look at what's behind you. The library user has rows and rows of books behind him. The librarian just has a rug. But whatever. Maybe it's a magic carpet. I don't know.
Right.
But
could I interject real quick? We've got a raised hand, so I wanted to give someone a chance to chat, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
This is from Sasha. Sasha, I'm going to allow you to talk now. There we go.
Sasha's mute. Oh, there she goes.
Yep, there you go.
I'm so sorry. That was an accident.
Oh, no worries at all. I do have another person raising their hand, unless, they also lowered their hand. Well, okay. Thanks, Sasha. If you have a question later, feel free to hop back in.
So Duncan, we were on a thread here about like the connection between learning and the library kind of being that place. Like that is an interesting concept to me. And I think, it might be helpful for librarians. And I also want to talk about how you and I connected, right? Like the intersection of our worlds, how we came kind of crashing together. But I can even type this in the chat here if it's helpful. But it took me about 25 years to come up with this definition of entrepreneurship. And maybe this would be useful for librarians, but I think of it as the self-directed pursuit of opportunities to create value for others. And the second part of the definition is that by creating value for others, we empower ourselves. So it's almost like an altruistic paradox, but I think that's a definition that anyone can embrace in any situation. Doesn't require you to drop out of school or quit your job or mortgage your house and start a business. It's really about trying to find ways that we can become more useful to more humans. And, just as soon as I came up with this definition and I was all proud of myself that this was some sort of a novel idea, I stumbled across an essay written by Seneca in 64 AD, in which he said, it's the duty of a man to figure out how to make himself useful to other men, as useful as possible to as many as possible. Because by doing so, he advances the well-being of mankind. I mean, it's essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but that's it. So thank you for dropping that in there, Nick, into the chat. So Duncan, and it's interesting because, you know, you're a librarian turned entrepreneur. Do I have that in the right sequence? I mean,
Yes.
you were a librarian first, and then you saw a problem and you created a product. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about how your own entrepreneurial journey, and then we'll talk about how our paths collided.
Sure. I mean, I was a public librarian in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, Forsyth County Public Library. And for the first 2 years of my practice, I worked in something called the Adult Continuing Education Department, which in the 1980s, which is when that was an educational brokerage service. We worked with job seekers. We worked with people who were changing careers. We did library programs, you know, on all kinds of topics. One of my most successful programs was a Saturday morning program on Dungeons and Dragons, but that's a whole nother webinar topic.
Yeah.
I'll happily host that one.
Right. All right, we'll talk about that later. But anyway, what happened was I got promoted to managing a branch library in Kernersville, North Carolina. And what I found was that people kept coming in and saying, gosh, I just finished reading Danielle Steele's latest book and I love her. Who writes just like her? I wasn't reading Danielle Steele. I didn't know.
Right.
And there wasn't any resources really. There were very few print reference resources. And the real kicker was at that point in time, you know, in libraries, you can look things up in the catalog by subject headings. Well, fiction did not have subject headings at the adult level.
Right.
To Kill a Mockingbird, you could find it if you search by title, you could find it if you search by author, but there was nothing that would tell you how to find something more like that.
Mm.
And so when I would talk to my colleagues about how do you get better at answering this question, they said, well, you just have to read more. Well,
it's only so many hours in a day.
Right. You know, and,
Yeah.
and you know, I'm a selfish kind of guy. So at the end of the day, I want to read what I want to read. You know, but anyway, so that haunted me.
Right.
Yeah, so that kind of haunted me for a while. And so
but that's an interesting part of the story right there, Duncan. It's like you found a problem and that problem's kind of up in your brain, you know, gestating or something there, that it's incubating. That's an interesting part of the process.
Right. And so this is in the early 1980s, right? It was not until the late 1980s, early 1990s that I began to come up with the idea or speculate, could a computer help us solve this problem?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I had two friends who were computer programmers, and we began to think about if we created a database that would let us search quickly, you know, and then have subject headings for novels, you know, then I wouldn't have to read as fast. And I could just use a resource the way I did for all the other reference questions that I was dealing with in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And so we came up with a prototype. I would sit down with any librarian I could find and say, let me show you this. Let them search on it.
Yeah.
They would make suggestions. And eventually, after 3 years from, you know, can we build this thing, to we got a working prototype, sold our first copy in March of 1994.
Wow.
So
there was a long gestation period there. I mean, from early 80s to the early 90s. Yeah. People don't get that, Duncan. I mean, I was writing about that this morning. I mean, people are looking for this overnight success. They think, oh, I just need a great idea and it's going to take off overnight, and they don't realize that you don't quit your day job in the meantime.
Because we didn't.
Right?
We didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, we actually got to the point where we were going to quit. We'd sold our first copy and we said, well, it's been fun. And
right.
And I had been talking to a company that was making library catalog software, right? It's probably more jargon than we need to get into. Anyway, we wound up with a company that agreed to back us if we wanted to try to make this real. And so in 1994, July 1 of 1994, Roger, my partner, and I quit our day jobs and went to work for NoveList full time.
Wow.
And 25 years later, 60 plus people are working on that product, and it's in the majority of public libraries in the United States.
Yeah. That's such a great story, Duncan. I love it. I love that story. And it really, for those of you who are not familiar with our work, I spent the last 20 years traveling around the world interviewing hundreds and hundreds of the underdog entrepreneurs, like the people you never heard of. And
Yep.
I was deliberate about that part of our work, Duncan, because, studying the backstory to Elon Musk or Henry Ford is kind of like looking at lottery winners to understand financial literacy, or good fiscal responsibility. I mean, it's just sort of like, it's the apex fallacy. We're studying these outliers that really don't tell us much about what the everyday entrepreneur does. So that's a super interesting story, and we could go down that thread, and I there's so much I want to unpack here, but I want for the audience to understand how did, because a big part of the work, and full disclosure here, a big part of the intersection of our work is you're using our Ice House entrepreneurship programs, bringing that into libraries as a resource for libraries. So can you just kind of talk about how you stumbled across our work and what that has, how that's working in your world now?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, Roger and I decided that we'd been running NoveList for 25 plus years. We had an extremely talented group of people there who were more than capable, of running that and taking it to the next level. And especially since Roger and I had started saying things like, well, we tried that a few years ago and it didn't work. And we kind of went, we just aren't good for this anymore.
Yeah.
New people need to be taking this to the next level who don't say that, and so we stepped out, and EBSCO asked me to stay on as a strategist for public libraries. At that time was about the time Kauffman made its first grant to the Urban Libraries Council. And I started seeing a resurgence of interest in entrepreneurship in public libraries. And so I was trying to figure out how to get involved and learn more about this space. And NCIDEA, a private foundation in North Carolina in Durham, was interested in training people to teach mindset. Your program.
Teach the entrepreneurial mindset. Yeah.
And they were looking for volunteers, and I volunteered. And I had to do some talking.
What do you mean you had to do some talking?
Well, I applied to convince
NCIDEA to allow you in, like it was a scholarship kind of a thing.
It was a scholarship.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah. So anyway, so they, I went and met with John Austin, and a staff member, there, and he said, I just don't understand what a librarian wants to do. Why a librarian wants to be part of this,
Mm,
And I
yeah.
told him the novelist story, and he said, "Well, yeah, but why? What does the librarian want to be part of this?" And
Well, that was my initial comment. It's just like, it's like cognitive dissonance for a lot of people.
exactly. And so John had a quilt on his wall, hanging on his wall, like not like this one, but some, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And I said, John, every day in some public library in this country, somebody walks up to the desk and goes, I make quilts. I wonder if I could start a quilting business.
Yeah.
And he went, oh. And that's how I got into training, and that's how I met you.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I just told the novelist story, but I sat in that training and I watched my life. I watched the life of novelist march across that screen, because every step you talked about, every challenge, every opportunity, that was our story. And as a result of that, I felt like this is a resource that public libraries can use to help empower their communities. This is all about helping people discover the entrepreneur that resides inside them, which is essential. I mean, helping people discover and become who they want to be is the main mission of a public library, again, in my opinion.
So Duncan, I got to interrupt you here for a second, because this is so interesting. Like, I set out, I co-authored the book, Who Owns the Ice House, with Clifton Talbert. And the subtitle of the book is 8 Life Lessons from an Unlikely Entrepreneur. Right? And this was the culmination of about 200 interviews that we did for a project for the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute, where I interviewed 200 unlikely entrepreneurs across the United States. And when I heard Clifton's story, as he came of age in the Mississippi Delta, born in the 1940s to a teenage mom in a poor cotton community in a town called Glen Allen, Mississippi, came of age in the 1950s, didn't know a dad. He was living with relatives, aunts, uncles, grandparents. And he said when he was a 13-year-old boy, he went to work with his Uncle Cleve, who owned the local ice house. And it was Uncle Cleve that taught him how to think like an entrepreneur. We wrote that book and created the companion course for exactly the same reasons, Duncan, to show people, to demystify the process, to demystify it and to democratize it, right? Because, at the end of the day, it's not really complicated. It's a very fundamental, simple process that anyone can embrace. We just get all wrapped around the axle, as my colleague Rob Herndon likes to say, thinking about it as a business discipline, all this complexity and business plans and all that. It's really simple. You can empower yourself by making yourself useful to other humans. That's the fundamental. So that's the reason we created the Ice House program. So it's not only did our lives intersect, Duncan, but our intentions.
Oh yeah.
Collided, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's no question about that. I mean, this is all about, this is about empowerment.
It's about empowerment. It's about empowerment, Duncan. That's where you and I are one heart.
And ultimately the public library is about empowerment. It is about helping, as I've said, it's about helping people achieve the life they want to live. And the thing that I like about the entrepreneurial mindset and the work that you and your colleagues at Eli have done is it creates a vehicle that allows the exploration of that. Okay. Because, we're in a world right now that is tremendously uncertain. I mean, when Eli started, you were addressing one kind of uncertainty.
Right.
We have about 4 or 5 others on top of that fundamental uncertainty that you were talking about, right? And it's going to require a tremendous amount of innovation. It's going to require all of us to at least acknowledge that we have an inner entrepreneur, whether or not we choose to awaken that entrepreneur is a choice.
That's right.
But I just want people to have the choice.
Right.
When I talk to my library colleagues, say, the outcome that we're looking for here is not the number of successful businesses that get started. That's great. But the real outcome is people have made an informed choice about whether this is the path for them or not.
Right. Right. And like I said earlier, Duncan, you can be very innovative and entrepreneurial and not own the business. I mean, whoever's name is on the business is irrelevant, right? But what you're hitting on is that I want to just kind of come back to this simple idea at the core of it that's so often lost is that you can empower yourself by finding ways to make yourself useful to others.
Gary, I mean, NoveList is successful on many levels, including financially, and I certainly appreciate the financial benefit I have received from the work that I've done with NoveList. Right, that was not the motivator. The motivator was I wanted meaningful work for myself and others.
Duncan, that is such an important point. And I got to tell you, I set out on this journey to interview entrepreneurs. I set out for real as part of this Cisco Entrepreneur Institute in 2008, I think it was. And I kept hearing from entrepreneurs, and some of the entrepreneurs started out as underdogs. I remember one in particular, his name is David Petit. He's now part of the Ice House program, but he was a Native American inventor entrepreneur who grew up in abject poverty.
Yeah.
And, he's very, very wealthy, and he was very, very wealthy by the time I got to interview him. But I kept hearing from these entrepreneurs, it's not about the money, it's not about the money, it's not about the money. And sometimes, I really couldn't understand initially what they were trying to say. Was they some sort of a survivor's guilt? You didn't want to be looked upon as only interested in money. What were they trying to say? It's only after I began to go back to the library and look at the psychological literature that I started to realize what they were articulating. What you just articulated is, yes, I've got to earn money to keep my life going, to feed myself, keep a roof over my head. But there's a purpose-driven component to it. And we overlook this time and time again. We look at entrepreneurs as people who are just interested in making money. They're greedy people who are willing to exploit others for their own gain. And yes, again, that's like the Elon Musk. It's the apex fallacy, right? We look at or it's the visibility versus representation bias.
Well, I mean, I certainly, Gary, I think what happens is the media, the business media tells us a story.
Right.
And this financial success and, a private owner being able to send a rocket into space, all that is really good news. I mean,
Right.
it's in the sense of good, it's going to get attention.
Right.
The stories that we're telling are ultimately more impactful, and they're local.
That's it. And that's part of what Clifton and I were trying to do with Who Owns the Ice House. I think of the everyday unlikely entrepreneur, Duncan, as a positive deviant, right? And there are positive deviants in every community. There are Uncle Cleves in every community. They're underdog entrepreneurs. And by and large, we ignore them in favor of the Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, the overnight success stories. And it turns out, and this is a big part of our work, is that there's a lot to be learned from the observation and analysis of the everyday unlikely entrepreneur. The people who don't start with big ideas, access to venture capital, or an Ivy League MBA.
You used the term apex, a lot. What the apex tells us is a path of one,
right,
or a path of two or three.
Right.
What your work does is give us the everybody's path.
Right.
Let's see, and so that's kind of where that's just kind of what I want to say.
Yeah, well, that's what we did. That's exactly what we did, Duncan. I looked at, I went out to interview these entrepreneurs. I wanted to, and let me back up one step. I got this idea one day in 1991 when my gutter cleaning business had evolved to the point where I was financially doing as well as my peers that had gone off to college, that got straight A's and gone off to college or whatever. And I read a story in the newspaper it was in January of 1991, late January. It was in a Las Vegas newspaper. I was there attending a seminar. And it was a human interest story, metro section story. Guy lost his job. It was 91. We started really outsourcing. Jobs were going away. They weren't coming back. It was sort of a metro section story. Guy lost his job. There's a picture of him perched next to his wife on the sofa, in their living room. Unemployment's running out. They're afraid of losing their home. His wife is working 2 jobs, 2 shifts at a convenience store. And it's a story we've all heard. It's a story half of us have lived through ourselves. But that's where I was stricken with this idea that because of my entrepreneurial experience, and for no other reason, not intellectual superiority or any other reason, not any genetic predisposition, but because of my entrepreneurial experiences, my brain had evolved in such a way that I could now see opportunities everywhere. And why couldn't he? And that's what really set me on this path for real, Duncan. That's where I realized if I can somehow deconstruct the aggregate, to your point, the aggregate of the entrepreneurial mindset, what's the underlying logic that drives the behavior, that enables them to recognize opportunities, bring these ideas to life? That's how that's really where our work is. And that's what the Ice House program is really all about. It's a mindset. When I started interviewing these entrepreneurs, and at first they were just like a whole bunch of really interesting stories. Like I'd walk away, I got a camera guy with me, I walk away thinking, man, that was a cool story. But it was only after I heard 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 of these stories that I started to recognize the common patterns in the logic, the common patterns in the language. And that's really what the takeaway is. Like you said, it's not just a single story, it's the aggregate.
Right.
That's, yeah.
And Gary, facts will change our mind.
We like to think so, but well, I could argue with you about that later. But yeah,
But
I get the
stories
idea.
change our heart.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
And we talk about mindset here, and I agree. You have to change the way you think, but you also have to change the way you feel.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You know, because if you don't love it,
right.
if it's not in here, it's going to be a much harder road to success.
Well, that's 100%, and that's what I was alluding to earlier. Like when you know, I like to borrow from Jaime Casap, who was the former head of education at Google.
Right.
And when he said, like, stop asking students what they want to be when they grow up, and start asking them what problems they want to solve and what do they need to learn in order to solve those problems. I mean, I think that's the fundamental shift that occurs in the mind of the individual that changes everything.
Yeah.
Right? It's really a shift in perspective that changes the behavior. But you know, the other thing that I want to point out here, Duncan, is that, you know, our work is focused on the entrepreneurial mindset, the underlying beliefs and assumptions that drive entrepreneurial behavior. But all too often we make what psychologists would call a fundamental attribution error, which is the tendency to overemphasize the importance of our traits, our dispositional traits when explaining a person's behavior, while ignoring all the social, environmental, and situational factors that also play an enormous role, right? So here's what that looks like. Somebody you never heard of borrows a couple $1,000s from their mother-in-law and starts a business in somewhere you never heard of. And 20 years later, there's some big event. They sold the business. They just got merged or something. You know, they now employ 500 people. It's a big deal. They cashed out. They're worth $100 million. And the media rush to interview these people.
Yeah.
And they come away and they write these pieces that, you know, here's the 5 things you need to be a successful entrepreneur. Here's the 5 characteristics or the 7 traits or the 3 habits or the whatever. And what they fail to realize, Duncan, is that when the entrepreneur began on that journey, he or she had very little of those characteristics or traits. That those are the outcome of the pursuit of the compelling goal, to your point.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If the goal's not compelling, you're never going to get there.
Yeah. One of the things, you know, Gary, I just love spending time with you. I think it's great we've got an audience for this, but this is just very much like those, you know, sitting at dinner conversations we used to have.
Yep.
You know, one of the things I'm aware of is, you know, and Nick, is that several people have asked some particularly pointed
Yep.
or practical questions. So
I was waiting for a logical gap and I know both of you can keep going for a while. So I was just kind of waiting for a polite place to say, hey, let's get
you probably need to blow that whistle, you know.
Yes,
But one of the things I want to say before we get into the practical questions,
Yep.
in case I don't have an opportunity to say it at the end, is that really what is called for in this day and time is, I believe, is inspiration. People need to be inspired to look for and think about things differently. Okay. And in my opinion, we're talking about infrastructure investment in this country. And we need to be considering investing in our inspiration infrastructure. And the best metric for determining whether a community is investing in their inspiration infrastructure is their public library budget.
Right on.
Okay.
I like that, Duncan.
Yeah.
That's
Good.
great. So that's great. Now, actually, there's a question a little earlier that some folks have been throwing their ideas in on, but I wanted to get both of your takes on it. John is asking that his local library, are rebuilding here soon, and we're looking into making more of a type of co-working space there. He was looking for any ideas on doing that in existing libraries, both examples of that already being done and how you guys could see that being adopted in the future, co-working spaces.
So let's see. I know that in the Richland County Public Library in Columbia, South Carolina, that they've done things like when they rebuilt, they created a certain set of meeting rooms that could be used by people, on a regular basis, to do things like focus groups or have client meetings, those kinds of things. I think I'd have to do some more work and looking on libraries and co-working spaces. But I can tell you what I like about that idea. What I like about that idea is it has, I have a friend, I have a friend who is an entrepreneur. He talks about how, in his opinion, being an entrepreneur is living with one long unanswered question.
I love it.
That as soon as you figure out the answer to what you thought your question was, there is another question. And so one of the things I like is that in a co-working space, you're going to have people whose point of need is going to be near the resources to address that need.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the other thing that I would say is, if there are co-working spaces in your community, you should sort of be doing outreach work to those as a way of just making sure that they're aware you're available to them. Hope that helps. And by the way, I don't have a slide with my email address on it, but it's and Nick, if you know it, you can just put it in the chat there. Anybody on this call, feel free to email me and say, have some questions that I want to follow up with. Okay.
I'll actually put all three of our emails for that, or well, at least Duncan and I's. We're a little more communicative through that. But yeah, I think we'd all be happy to continue conversations. In fact, to that point, I think he's already signed off, but Vladimir had a few questions that I'm still going to ask because they may be relevant to others, but he popped his email in the chat for us to communicate with him after the fact. But that's great. Gary, did you have any quick thoughts on the co-working space question?
No, not off the top of my head, Nick. I think that libraries can become very vibrant, like co-working spaces. Mm-hmm. I just think that's a continuation of the legacy of libraries. I mean, I think that's
absolutely
the Duncan's opening comment. That's kind of what they've always been.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I see it's kind of perpetuating some of those other barriers to libraries becoming hubs of entrepreneurship. Is there's so many disparate priorities, right? And people don't think of the library as an easy, accessible meeting place for folks, but because they think, oh, that's a place to be quiet and to learn by yourself, not to connect with others. And I mean, I live in Cleveland Heights where Gary was, and our public library is beautiful. It's a fantastic place to be in. I can't wait till COVID-19 is a little more taken care of so that we can go there and live within our community again. It's a great place. Yeah. So moving on from there, Deborah was talking about when our library partners with programs aimed at entrepreneurs, there's often an inherited curriculum mindset that can create an obstacle when participants kind of glaze over when there's an on-screen or at-screen instruction on demographics, other research tools, for example. So just wanting kind of both of your takes in terms of how to make the ever active mind of an entrepreneur connect to programming around something specifically like entrepreneurship or whatever it is they may be learning about.
I was just having a conversation this morning with Mid-Continent Public Library in Missouri, and that library has about 5 business specialists who are very active in their entrepreneurial ecosystem, and they were talking about stages of development, right? That, there's sort of an ideation stage, there's or bigger buckets are early stage, launch, and growth. One of the things you have to be careful about is helping entrepreneurs understand the journey they're on and their place in that journey. Because if you introduce resources at a point where they're not in that stage, then it really does just kind of go over their head, right?
Yeah.
If I'm just trying to get my handle on, do I have a good idea or not? Market research isn't necessarily what I need to do. I need to talk to some more people. I need to define the product concept. So that may be something. Yeah. And libraries, in my opinion, have a lot of growth to do in this. We're very good at somebody asks a question and we answer the question. What we sometimes are not good at is understanding the process that the user is engaged in. So,
that's
part of our value can be establishing the context and helping the user understand where they are in this journey that they're on. I think is where is a real powerful potential value for us.
Right, and I'm going to piggyback on that, Duncan. It's for simplicity's sake. There's sort of 3 phases of change, and this is drawing from a concept called transformation theory, developed by a guy named Dr. George Land. But there's a discovery phase, and that's where we're trying to figure out how to make ourselves useful. We're still tinkering, we're learning. In the discovery phase, it's trial and error. It's what we could refer to as error-based learning. It's micro experimentation, right? And so if the aspiring entrepreneur, small business owner is in that phase, like it's helpful to understand that, because to what your point, Duncan, the attitudes and skills required to discover an opportunity are very much distinct from the attitudes and skills required to exploit that opportunity.
That's right. Yeah.
So the discovery phase is all about trial and error. So this is why, I rail against business planning, because it really doesn't work. It actually undermines the entrepreneur's ability to discover something, right? The entrepreneur is actually behaving in this phase like a scientist, following basically the principles of the scientific method. I wouldn't tell that to somebody on their first visit to the library, but that's what it essentially is. But the point that you made, Duncan, which is an important point, is that the attitudes and skills required to discover that opportunity are very different from the attitudes and skills required to exploit it.
Right.
And so you have to diagnose, are you in the discovery phase or are you in the growth phase? Because once you discover, once the entrepreneur has evidence of usefulness, and it goes to my point about the scientific method. It's an evidence-based discovery process.
Right.
We're trying lots of things. To your point, Duncan, when somebody agrees to pay for it, that transaction is essentially evidence of usefulness.
Right.
And so once you have evidence of usefulness, then the discovery skills kind of get tamped back. And now we have to go into replication and growth. We have to replicate the useful thing we found, right? Now, the third phase is the obsolescence phase. That's when what you've been doing stops working and you need to reinvent yourself, right? And librarians, I'm sure, coming to people, I noticed in the comments, somebody talked about the workforce development game, right? That's really what that's about, where you're facing obsolescence or reinvention. You're at that sort of intersection where you kind of have to go back to the discovery phase again. So super important point, Duncan. And you know, we have a tool baked into our training, into our entrepreneurial mindset programs to help people diagnose that. Are you in the discovery phase? Are you in the delivery phase? Or are you in the reinvention phase?
That's right. Yeah, I think
really different.
Yeah, and I think the other thing a connection I want to make between what we just talked about and people who are dealing with obsolescence, or people, the large number of people the businesses they used to work for are gone, you know,
Right.
or they are the owners of those businesses and they're trying to figure out how to keep going.
Yep.
The skills and the attitudes and the process that we're talking about does two things. One, any business today in the uncertain environment that we're working with really shouldn't be looking for people who want to show up and be told what to do.
Right.
They really aren't looking for employees. I believe they're looking for, on some level of meaning, co-owners, or people who have an ownership feeling about the place they work.
Well, that's, you know, Duncan, I'll give you the $20 later for saying that, because that's really what Ice House is designed to do. Our entrepreneurial mindset program is designed to do. I don't care whether you want, like, starting a business is one way to manifest an entrepreneurial mindset, but it's not the only way. And what you just talked about is the fundamental shift that our programs are designed to facilitate, which is that shift. It's like, you've got to figure out how to make yourself useful, more useful in any situation that you're in. And you're capable of that. The skills required to figure out how to make ourselves useful on our own are skills that we can all learn to develop. But it's important to understand that these are skills that have historically been not only overlooked or ignored, but discouraged in our systems of education and in our organizational structure.
They have not been exercised.
They have not been exercised. So the capacity to be innovative and entrepreneurial, I mean, part of my entrepreneurial mindset theory, Duncan, is that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned. That we're all born innately curious. We're all born with an innate desire to be engaged in work that has meaning and purpose, that contributes to the greater good. This is all intrinsically part of everyone. We learn not to do those things.
And I think the other thing I want to say to my public library colleagues, and for folks who is another way to think about the public library, is the public library serves people from all ages, at all stages of life. And so the promise of the public library, or the potential of the public library, is that it can instill or repair, you know, it can instill curiosity or resuscitate curiosity that's been tamped down at any stage of life.
I love that, Duncan. It's resuscitating. It's exactly.
right?
Exactly.
And so one of the things I keep hoping my colleagues will do is I want, we're very good at summer reading programs that were designed to prevent the backslide in reading ability.
Right.
Right.
Right. I mean, documented, successful, very popular programs. I believe we have the potential to do the same thing with curiosity via entrepreneurial mindset training as a summer program for teens and whoever. There you go.
Well, I love your comment, Duncan. I wrote it down, like inspiration infrastructure. It's got to start with inspiration. I 100% agree with you. You can't just, and Clifton told me that when we started on this journey together, my co-author, who's a Pulitzer nominee, said you have to connect the head to the heart. And that's really, really an important part of it. I was writing about this also recently, working on an article for Forbes that ultimately what we need is to balance like our enthusiasm and our inspiration with a little bit of skepticism. I mean, that's kind of the magic mix for the entrepreneur. You've got to be excited about the idea. You've got to be ready to go big game hunting with a sharp stick. But you've also got to be armed with a little bit of humility and a little bit of skepticism, precisely for the reasons that skepticism is inherent in the scientific method. As Richard Feynman said, the first trick is not to fool yourself. And you're the easiest person to fool when it comes to the entrepreneurial journey.
Yeah.
Sure.
Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I was just going to say, with only 9 minutes left, we have a couple big questions that I think are worth talking about while we still have the forum. So let's
Sure.
keep that conversation going. The first is, so we've been talking a lot about how libraries are inherently capable of being this avenue for entrepreneurial change in a community and being a collective space for that learning in whatever way the librarians and the participants choose to do so. But Michael is asking in the Q&A how to convince local librarians of the necessity of this. He's talking about his particular community of around 20,000 people, that a library is a meaningful hub for that. And this connects to a few other comments about bringing in small business development and economic development partners into the library. So wondering if I could get both of your takes briefly on sorry, on how to, yes, on how to kind of convince the librarian. We've been talking about convincing others that the library is the right place to go, but how can we convince a librarian of this need? Right.
So the first thing I would do is let's take that word convince out of there, and
Right.
let's start a conversation. Okay. And I don't know the particular situation that you're talking about. That town of 20,000, was that right, Nick?
That's in Ireland.
Yes.
Is pretty small, and probably very under-resourced facility. So to the extent that you as a community individual and maybe representative of a partner, I would suggest that you approach the library with having a conversation about, do you think this would be a good idea? Or would you be open to having a program or just a meeting to talk about what we might be able to do here? Okay. And one of the things in terms of growing entrepreneurial ecosystems, I want to reference back to Brad Feld's Startup Communities, that talks about the fact that ecosystems need to be entrepreneur-led. that this would be a
It's
good
bottom
example.
up.
Bottom up. This would be a good example of
It's bottom
someone,
up.
going to a resource and saying, can you help us do this? As opposed to going to the library and saying, I want to talk you into doing this. Offer to make it possible.
Right. We're
Yeah.
not used vacuum cleaner salesmen here. We're trying to build actual community.
That's right.
That's the goal here.
Right.
Right. It
Yeah,
may
yeah.
end up being sales, but yeah, that's good.
That help?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
part of the answer to that also goes back to like the redefinition. Like that, the word entrepreneurship is a big word. It means a lot of different things to a lot of people. So I fully understand why people would think this isn't really relevant to me. That's part of the work we're trying to do at Eli, is to redefine it in a way that everyone can embrace it, because everyone needs to embrace it.
Yeah, I think the other thing to flip this around for the librarians in the program who want to build relationships with small business centers and other ecosystem partners, the same thing. Go and just talk. And find out what their needs are, what their challenges are. And here's a really very specific example. Libraries have more market share in their communities than almost any other organization.
Wow. Yeah.
In many communities, 50% or more of the residents have a library card.
Yeah.
So your reach is huge. And especially in a digital environment that we're in right now, you don't have to have the small business center class in your library. You can just promote it on your website. Just drop it into your events calendar.
That's a good point, Duncan. A partnership doesn't have to look like the whole kit and caboodle of fully integrating services. It can just be lifting up each other's programming.
Yeah, and I think that small wins. It's very entrepreneurial approach, micro experiments. Just do that. And I agree with Nancy. The libraries in many communities are the hub, and they can become the hub.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Okay. Yep.
Well, Duncan, with those comments, you kind of covered several of the other questions. So well done there. Very well done. Anything else that there was one bigger question that I would like to get your takes on from Wasanique, who is no longer on the call, but I think it bears an important point, which is the connection to resources to achieve some of these inspirational dreams and minds. So it's that kind of, all right, we've validated the idea is worthwhile. Now what? How do I get into resources, and how can libraries play a role in that? And they mention Kauffman documents this frequently, and they're seeking info on who can help to close the resource gap specifically.
Yeah. So I would like to address that question, Nick, first of all, by saying, the question may or may not be getting at the heart of a misunderstanding of entrepreneurship. That you don't really need money to start a business. And I know that sounds a little bit flippant, but it's not. And people think, oh, okay, now I just need somebody to give me a lot of money to do it. The vast majority of businesses are started with a few hundred or a few $1,000s cobbled together from credit cards, second mortgages, friends, fools, and family. And so that's one way to think about the question. Like, once you have usefulness, you have evidence of usefulness, what the entrepreneurs tend to do is what we would call bootstrap their way into business. It's another way of saying it's client-funded business. They find a customer to pay for the product or service, and they use those funds to grow the business. That's how a lot of entrepreneurs actually bring their ideas to life. And I wanted to say that because I don't want to perpetuate the myth that resources are the missing link, because in a lot of cases they're not. It's like understanding the logic is the missing link.
Yeah, I think, I certainly don't disagree with that, Gary. I think the other thing is helping people understand what their personal capacity is. I mean, if you're already carrying a lot of debt, you have to figure out to balance that. And that's part of that's the fear factor stuff. But you do have to have a certain amount of financial literacy and flex. Even if that flex is the unemployment check or the stimulus check that may be coming your way.
Right.
Correct. And that's part of our Ice House training, the mindset training, is really about being resourceful.
Right.
Like learning how to make it work with what you've got. Like start where you are, use what you have.
Yeah. Yep.
And go from there. Yeah.
Got it. Cool.
So as we're going to wrap up here, Nick, we got into all the questions. I wanted to just make a few final comments. Are we good to go there?
Sasha made a good comment, which I think bears repeating, just in that kind of start where you are mentality that both you and Duncan have been kind of bringing up the whole time. Sometimes the support that we're providing for a small business or an entrepreneur looks like helping them update their Facebook page or create a simple website. It doesn't have to be a handheld, perfectly constructed program that we've put together. Sometimes it is just the little things that get in the way of them continuing their discovery process, right? And so that's that community component.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point, which also leads me to want to make another point, which is that, sometimes the most important part of our inspiration infrastructure is to connect the fledgling entrepreneur with other local entrepreneurs.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is enormous. And, the psychologists call that relatable social models. And that's something else that librarians may or may not be able to do, is to start to understand who are the other underdog entrepreneurs in their community that want to become part of this ecosystem, either through, a 1 million cups event. But you can often do more for an aspiring entrepreneur by connecting them with another aspiring entrepreneur
Yeah. I mean, there are actually some libraries that have an entrepreneur in residence kind of program, but that's, that kind of connection and community there is, and I just really think that it is, and I just so appreciate the comment that you brought up, Nick, about helping them with their Facebook page. Sometimes the barrier is cash. Sometimes the barrier doesn't require cash, and libraries can help with that too.
Right.
All right. So Nick, I'm going to just share my screen very briefly, if you'll allow me, just as we wind down here. Let me see if I can make this work. So
we are seeing your screen.
You got my screen there. All right. So I want to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar. Duncan, thank you for being part of this. Nick, thank you for your support. I want to remind everyone that we are the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. We're the world's leading provider of entrepreneurial mindset, education, training, and professional development programs. You can learn a lot more about our work at elimindset.com. So we're also the creators of the Ice House Entrepreneurial Mindset programs, which have been recognized around the world, have been recognized by the United Nations, by the Kauffman Foundation, by the European Commission, as redefining entrepreneurship education in classrooms and communities worldwide. That's the program that we're working with EBSCO to get into libraries across the United States, if you want to learn more about that. You can also attend a webinar we do each month about the Entrepreneurial Mindset program, the Ice House programs, how to encourage entrepreneurial thinking in yourself and others, whether you're a teacher, a librarian, a leader, a manager, a community stakeholder. We have these webinars once every month. I also wanted to tell you briefly about a new program we're launching, a summer boot camp program, Entrepreneurial Mindset, for young high school age, young adults, college age kids. It's an 8-week intensive program to immerse them in entrepreneurial experiences to help them develop entrepreneurial attitudes, behaviors, and skills. You can also learn more about that on our website. And lastly, I hope you'll join us next month for the Entrepreneurship in Education webinar series. My guest will be Jonathan Ortmans, who is the founder and CEO of the Entrepreneurial, Jen, it was one out of my head. Jonathan is the Gen Network. Jonathan is probably one of the most prolific supporters of entrepreneurship globally. The work that he is doing with the Global Entrepreneurship Network, thank you. Global Entrepreneurship Network, Global Entrepreneur Congress, the work he's doing is just extraordinary to cultivate entrepreneurship around the world. So I hope you'll join us for that webinar next month. Until then, hope to talk with all of you soon. Again, Duncan, thanks for being with us today.
Pleasure, and I appreciate everybody on the call, and especially my library colleagues who are doing such great work out there. So keep it up, gang, and thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.